here today. I am really excited to share with you some of the recent projects that I have been involved in. So I will jump right in. So as most of you are probably familiar, the climate of Hawaii is extremely diverse. So the spatial patterns vary over very small areas, and this is due largely in part to our extremely complex topography, as you can see here. And in order to capture these steep gradients in these different climate variables, particularly rainfall, and capture these complex patterns, we need very high resolution data sets. So the Department of Geography and Environment, led by the group led by Tom Jambaluka in the Department of Geography at UH Manoa, has been working to develop these spatially continuous statewide gridded climate data products for many years. And the first one that I was involved with was the 2011 launch of our Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii. And most of you are probably familiar with this resource. It is a set of mean monthly and annual rainfall maps covering a 30-year period, so 1978 to 2007. And when we released these new maps of mean rainfall for the state, we wanted to put them out there in a way that was accessible to users. So we created a website, rainfall.geography.hawaii.edu, and we built into our project time to build this website, create an interactive map so that, and you don't need to know how to use GIS to access the data in these maps. And we created downloads of both image files and GIS layers in as many different data formats and units as we could. So we wanted to make this a usable resource for people. And it's, I'd say, been very successful throughout the state. I think we've had over 150,000 users since it launched. We've been cited in hundreds of different papers, so this is a really useful resource that we really tried to put out there in ways that people can access. In 2014, we launched 3 additional websites. So this was part of an evapotranspiration project. So we understood the mean rainfall patterns of water coming into the system. So this project was to understand evapotranspiration, the amount of water leaving the system. And for this project, we created mean hourly, monthly, annual climate maps. So not just the average January solar radiation, but the average 2 p.m. January solar radiation. So with this project, we also created an interactive map, and you can get access to over 40 different variables on our website. So we also have image downloads and GIS layers here as well. And because we figured many people may not know what evapotranspiration was, but there still could be useful climate data for them, we created a solar and a climate website as well that all have the same data on there. So just replace the word rainfall with climate, evapotranspiration, or solar, and you'll get access to these data. Following on the rainfall data set, the Rainfall Atlas, for my master's, I created a data set of monthly rainfall maps going all the way back to 1920. So all of these maps are high resolution, 250 meter, spatially continuous for the state. So this data set goes from 1920 to 2012, and you, again, can download it from the Rainfall Atlas of Hawaii website. In 2017, Matt Lucas took those monthly rainfall maps and created a gridded drought index product. So these are maps of drought. So reds are showing drought periods, blues are showing wet periods. So we now have this great high resolution spatial data set of drought going all the way back to 1920. And so we've been doing some analysis from this gridded data set recently, including analysis of individual drought events through time. So we extracted the average values from the statewide maps to look at a time series, and we can pick out individual drought events that have happened over time. And so for this period, 1920 to 2012, you can see that we've had 15 drought events over this time. And some of the recent ones that have been really severe are the 1998 to 2002 drought and the 2007 to 2012 drought. And again, this data is all from those gridded rainfall, or those gridded drought maps. We've also looked at mapping individual drought events. So for that 1998 to 2002 drought and the 2007 to 2012 drought, we've created maps of the individual event. So condensing all that information to look at the amount of time each location was in drought and how severe the drought was over that time. So the size of the points, the large points are going to show you that it was in drought about 100% of the time, and the darker the red, the more severe the drought. So this 1998 to 2002 drought, you can see, really impacted the leeward areas of the Big Island more severely than the windward areas. And Oahu and Kauai really had, both of those islands were in drought almost that entire time, and pretty severe. And then when you look and compare to the 2007 to 2012 drought, you can see that over this 6-year period, almost the entire Big Island was in severe drought that entire time. So again, this is condensing information from these gridded data sets to do these different types of analyses. In 2019, Ryan Longman led the development of daily gridded climate maps. So we now have daily maps of rainfall and temperature for a 25-year time period. So from 1990 to 2014, you can now get daily rainfall and temperature maps. And so these are also available for download as GIS layers. Again, 250-meter high resolution and over 9,000 files for each variable. So lots and lots of data coming out of the geography department. Currently, Matt Lucas is leading an effort to take those daily rainfall and temperature maps and create new gridded drought index data that's very useful for fire management. So the KBDI is another drought index that requires rainfall and temperature to create. So they're looking at creating a gridded data set of 25-year drought index from that. And the latest effort is looking to create near real-time monthly maps. So all of these past projects have had end dates. So right now they're working on using the available data near real time to produce maps so that there's no more end date. You can get last month's rainfall, September 2019, as soon as October starts based on preliminary data. Some of the other gridded data sets that are out there, we've done some trend analysis in rainfall. So at every single pixel, I've calculated the trend in rainfall from 1920 to 2012 and then mapped those trend values. So these rainfall trend maps, the colors are showing you the slope of the trend. So yellows, oranges, and reds are drying trends, while the blues are showing you increasing trends. And I've done this for different seasons, annual wet season and dry season. And anything with this black hatching is statistically significant. So over this period, 1920 to 2012, you can see that drying trends are seen across the state, but with complex spatial patterns. If you follow East Maui in all the seasons, we see significant declines. But the area that really stands out is the West Hawaii region, which has experienced the most severe declines in rainfall over this period. I've also calculated these same trends for a more recent 30-year period, so 1983 to 2012. And you can see that the 30-year drying trends are more severe, and especially for the dry season, that we have very strong drying trends across the state. So this resource is also available for download on our Rainfall Atlas website. You can get image maps of all of the rainfall trends that I've shown here. And again, hammering home this point that we can extract from these spatially continuous data sets at any given location and perform analysis on the data. So this is extracting the time series of rainfall data for one location in Kona and looking at trends over different time periods. So these data allow us to look at and dive deeper into any location in the state. We've also used these maps to compile composites of how El Nino and La Nina events affect our rainfall. So these are rainfall during strong El Nino events and during strong La Nina events, and broken up by season. And we can see that strong El Nino events tend to bring us anywhere from 10 to 80% below normal rainfall in the winter months, while strong La Nina events bring us anywhere from 10 to 50% above normal rainfall in winter, and an opposite signal in the summer months. So from these rainfall maps, we can see very clearly that El Nino brings us a wet summer and a dry winter, and La Nina is the opposite. And we have future climate projections. So there are also spatially continuous gridded data sets of future projections for the Hawaiian Islands. And currently there are 2 projections that are available, and I'll talk much more about this towards the end of the talk, but a statistical downscaling and a dynamical downscaling set of projections. And these are available in a format called netcdf files. Some are available as GIS raster files, but these are a little bit more difficult to download and process at this time. So from that, I want to transition into some of the work I've been focused on in the last few years that has really led me into this more knowledge exchange and actionable science work. And this is doing a synthesis of drought for the Hawaiian Islands. And this was while I was working as a postdoc with the USDA Forest Service on funding from the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center. So what we wanted to do is not only analyze that gridded drought data set, that first one that I showed you, but we also wanted to synthesize drought impacts across different sectors in Hawaii. So we wanted to understand the meteorological characteristics of drought in Hawaii, how drought impacts agricultural systems, the hydrological impacts of drought, and then looking at ecological and socioeconomic impacts of drought as well. And in this work, we started to discover, just in the peer-reviewed literature, that there's not a lot that's really been published on the ecological and socioeconomic impacts of drought in Hawaii. And when we started talking with some of the resource managers, we started realizing that there are lots of impacts of drought that are happening on the ground that have not been published, right? Especially considering the global impacts of drought and how we've seen lots of tree mortality caused by drought. We were curious if that was happening here in Hawaii, but we can't find much published on it. So this also led us into, more conversations with the resource managers, and we started to ask questions about what kinds of actions are resource managers taking to prepare for and cope with drought here in Hawaii. And so this led to a Forest Service report, which should be coming out this year, where we looked at management options in response to drought. And this was for Hawaii and US-affiliated Pacific Islands. But working with resource managers on our author team, we tried to assess the different options, the different actions that managers take in response to drought in 4 different areas: water resources, agriculture, wildfire, and native and invasive species. And we included some case studies here as well. So this got us thinking more and more about decision-making with respect to drought. And we started asking questions like, are all of these gridded data sets that I've shared with you, are they being used by the resource managers? I still give talks for Department of Defense managers who have never heard of the Rainfall Atlas and aren't aware of any of the work that's coming out of UH in this regard. So are these data being used? If they're not using these data, which other resources are they using for their decision making? How do people get their information? So are they doing Google searches? Are they talking to their neighbor or community members? How are they getting the information that they use? What types of decisions are being made with these data or without these data? But when to do restoration or outplanting, when they need to be, where they need to build new water reservoirs on the landscape, things like that. What kinds of decisions are being made? Are they using climate data in planning their new management activities? And what kinds of products are useful? So are fact sheets useful? Are geospatial tools more useful? And across different sectors, this probably varies. So how accessible are we making the data that we have now? So for most of the gridded climate products I showed you, they're available for download on the Rainfall Atlas. It's a pretty centralized area. But there are still some of these data sets that are harder to find and are maybe not public yet. And in terms of the interactive maps, it's only the mean data that are currently available as interactive maps. So the rest are available as GIS layers, and most of them are statewide. But with GIS, you can extract data for any location. You can do time series analysis and very site-specific planning. But you need someone with GIS or technical skills in order to accomplish this. So especially in the context of drought, we realized that there's a need for a knowledge exchange. So resource managers want to be more actively engaged in research planning and knowledge co-production. So they're tasked with using best available science, but for drought, there's no central place to get all the drought data and information. And often there is limited training to access the information, perhaps limited time to interpret or apply a statewide data set to their management area. So, I think that scientists need to more carefully try to describe the implications of their results for management. And we need, in general, a more formal process to facilitate regular communication and exchanges and feedback between the scientists and managers. So this is borrowed from one of the Northwest CASC webinars that was out recently. They have a bunch of actionable science webinars. The typical model for disseminating information in academia tends to be that the researchers produce their results and they write a peer-reviewed publication, and we hope out there that there's a decision maker who finds our paper and is able to apply it and make decisions off of this. But that rarely works that way. In a more co-production model, you have collaborative co-creation of new knowledge by scientists, decision makers, and other stakeholders with the intention of making that science usable in practice. So it's two-way information sharing. You're collaborating and communicating with the decision makers at the beginning of the process. And the outputs that come may be peer-reviewed journal publications, but they may also be geospatial tools or maps or other visualizations. They may be media, interviews or outputs, and maybe workshops or trainings. There could be a lot of things that come out of this. So this is the general co-production model. And for fire, we have a model like this in the Pacific. This is the Pacific Fire Exchange, and we have Clay sitting right here in the room. So in 2011, the Pacific Fire Exchange was created with a mission to facilitate fire knowledge exchange and enable collaborative relationships among Pacific stakeholders, including resource managers, fire responders, researchers, landowners, and communities. And this has been extremely successful. The PFX serves as a clearinghouse for all fire-related data and resources. They do lots of translation of scientific and technical results into different tools and products. And they create opportunities for regular and consistent feedback between managers and researchers. So in one of our new projects, we are planning to pilot this knowledge exchange idea for drought. So this is funded by the PICASC to work with 3 partners in Hawaii to pilot this knowledge exchange idea. So to work with them to co-produce different drought products, making very site-specific results for each landscape, visualizations, maps, statistics, depending on the needs of each resource manager, and documenting management actions during past droughts to try to compile lessons learned. So with this, we're demonstrating 4 different aspects of a knowledge exchange: easier access to drought and climate information and data sources. So we're customizing for each management area. Better, more comprehensive information. We're synthesizing existing data from multiple sources. Improved technical assistance. So producing translated science summaries, hands-on training opportunities, developing decision support tools. And a more collaborative information transfer environment. So creating those opportunities for regular and consistent feedback between managers and scientists. So our 3 partners in Hawaii are Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and they are working on about 300,000 acres of land on the Big Island. They have over 53 threatened and endangered species on their landscape, with elevations from sea level up to 13,000 feet, with highly diverse ecosystems, rainforests all the way to arid deserts. And they are dealing with invasives, plants and animals, wildfire, and drought on their landscape. Our second partner is Puvawa Forest Reserve. So this is about 35,000 acres of land on the leeward side of Hawaii Island. They have about 24 federally listed species as well as many other rare and threatened species. About sea level to 6,500 feet, highly diverse dry and mesic forest. But they experience significant invasion by non-native grasses, which increase their wildfire risk. And they practice active grazing, cattle grazing on their landscape to reduce the fire fuel loads. So very interesting management happening on this landscape. And our third partner is the West Maui Mountains Watershed Partnership. So about 50,000 acres of land on Maui, about half is critical habitat. Elevation up to 6,000 feet. Again, lots of threatened, endangered, and rare species, and similar threats that they're dealing with on the landscape. Invasive plants and animals, wildfire, and highly drought prone on their leeward slopes. So I will briefly touch on some of the work that we've started with Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. So we're working very closely with Sierra McDaniel, who's the park botanist in Havo. And some of the initial work we've done with her, she's talked about that during the 2002 to 2003 drought, they had relative humidity down to the single digits in the park. It was extremely dry. And they had wildfires spreading into their safe areas. So wet forest areas they thought were immune to the impacts of wildfire. And despite all of their firefighting efforts, they had fire spread into their special ecological areas, which is where they do outplantings of their rare and endangered species, and the fire damaged one of their ungulate-proof fences. So before a drought, we wanted to assess different management actions. They're trying to reduce other stressors like ungulates and invasive plant species. They're trying to establish and maintain fuel breaks for fire. They're doing lots of monitoring on the landscape and expanding rare plant populations as much as possible. During an actual drought, the management actions that they're taking on this landscape are implementing fire prevention, so they stop high-risk activities like chainsawing or things that could send out sparks. They have to put out supplemental food and water for the nene to keep them alive. They do increased frequency of fence inspections because the ungulates are trying to come into the different areas to look for greener forage. They do more predator trapping and have to adjust restoration activities. And then after the drought occurs, they do post-fire restoration with more fire-tolerant native species and use their inventory and monitoring data to evaluate long-term changes. So lots of different management actions related to drought and fire. So some of the next steps working with Sierra are we are going to actually extract data for her different special ecological areas she's working in to get time series information from a lot of the gridded data sets that I showed earlier. So to help generate statistics and maps and look at historical trends and frequencies, as well as the future projections for the different areas. Working with her to document past impacts. One of the most interesting ones she told me about when I was there last, these polypoli fronds that are used in lei making, they weren't able to issue any permits to collect these during the last drought. So it's sort of a cultural impact that is happening because of drought that, again, hasn't been written down or documented anywhere. And working together to create more educational materials and identify new research priority areas. So on this knowledge exchange topic, we're expanding this work into the Western Pacific Islands. So we're going to be working in Palau, Guam, and Yap in the Western Pacific, where fire activity is very high. So we are going to do some detailed drought analysis out here and collaborate with resource managers, similar to how we're doing in Hawaii, to again document management responses, compile lessons learned, produce translated data products and visualizations. And we're currently set to partner with the Guam Department of Agriculture, the Yap State Division of Ag and Forestry, University of Guam, Pacific RISA, NOAA, UH, and ISWA Center. So lots of cool work coming here. We had an initial workshop in April of this year at the Pacific Island Forestry Professionals Workshop. So this was a workshop held in Hawaii where we had stakeholders from all 6 jurisdictions in the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. And We had a whole session where we got to ask them questions in breakout groups to understand what their concerns are with respect to drought in the region. So they said things like wildfire and impacts on native forests, understanding wet and dry cycles and impacts on fuel loads, how changing climate conditions will affect future drought and fire, and how to maintain drinking water supplies, especially under rising sea levels. We also asked what their needs were with regards to drought and fire. And some of the big ones were improving public awareness programs and fire warning systems, incorporating drought and fire into school curriculums, so doing more education in schools, and other decision support tools, and better engaging traditional knowledge and on-the-ground practitioners. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit to talk about some of the other work I've been doing here in Hawaii, working with downscaled climate projections. So for a bit of context, before I dive into the issues here, global climate models, or general circulation models, are what we use to simulate the Earth's future climate conditions. But they are very complex and computationally expensive, and often have to operate at a very coarse resolution spatially. So they can't capture the fine scale processes and topography that we have here in Hawaii. So this is just an example from Tasmania of a simulated change for rainfall based on a global model, and then what actual rainfall looks like with mountain ranges. So to overcome this limitation of spatial resolution, we use techniques called downscaling. So downscaling is what we use to relate these global model results to a local scale. And there are a whole suite of different downscaling methods, but two main types we talk about are statistical downscaling and dynamical downscaling. So statistical downscaling is a way to relate local observations to large-scale predictors. Okay, and then you apply that relationship between the stations and the large-scale predictors to the global climate model outputs. Okay, so this is a correlation map between a station in Hilo and vertical velocity across this giant domain. So you're making relationships with station observations. So it's based in observations. And it's a statistical method. It's computationally very fast. But one of the downsides it has is that it assumes relationships that exist today will continue to exist in the future. And that's called stationarity. So that assumption is something you have to consider when using this method. The other alternative downscaling method that's very common is dynamical downscaling. And this is when you use a regional climate model nested within a global climate model to get local scale information. And so as you can imagine, this is computationally very expensive. It takes a very long time to run and a lot of skill in tuning parameters to try to model the local climate. But it's based in physics, so it allows those relationships that exist today to change in the future. So no stationarity assumption. In Hawaii, we have both of these. We have dynamical downscaling results, future projections, and we have future projections from statistical downscaling. But they don't quite line up for a lot of categories. So the future period that they're projecting in, for dynamical, it's a 20-year period at the end of the century, 2080 to 2099. For statistical downscaling, it's a 30-year period in the future, 2070 to 2099. The time step for dynamical, the model is run at daily and monthly time steps, whereas statistical downscaling is only provided for seasonal, wet season and dry season outputs. The scenarios are the same between the two. They're both using CMIP5, RCP 4.5 and 8.5 scenarios, so different future carbon emission scenarios. The present day reference period is also different between these two. Dynamical downscaling simulates and models its own historical present day rainfall and temperature, whereas the statistical downscaling uses the Rainfall Atlas observation-based present day, which covers a 30-year period versus a 20-year period. They're using different numbers of global models and different spatial resolutions. So dynamical downscaling is at about 800 meters, and statistical, they have down to 250 meters. So as someone trying to use these data, this starts to become a little difficult to try to compare these two. The raw outputs that are given to us by the modelers are also provided in what's called a net CDF file. I apologize if you are very familiar with these and you already know what they are, but this is a very common data storage format for climate model outputs. It allows you to store all the time steps in one file. So I like to think of it like a file cabinet. So each folder is essentially a map at a different time step, and you're able to condense that all into one .netcdf file. And you can read it in programs like ArcGIS or R. And there's a free viewer that NASA puts out that's a really great reference if you're not familiar with it. It's called Panoply. So you can just plug in your .netcdf file and view it right online. Makes life easy. But yeah, in Hawaii, our raw data comes in .netcdf files. All the information is in the peer-reviewed journal articles, so it's written for a high science audience, so it's a little difficult to access the metadata sometimes. And there's not a lot of guidance on how to incorporate these raw climate projections into management plans or how to deal with the uncertainty. So based on some survey work done by Pacific RISA a few years ago, they found that the natural resource managers and agency decision makers see the application of climate projections in their decision making as challenging, especially from a technical perspective. So there's a role with these climate projections for knowledge transformers, or some intermediate folks that work with both the managers and the modelers to actively transform and translate these data so that people can use them. So this is kind of where I come in, is in that intermediate sort of position. So with the work I've been doing most recently, I have several objectives. The first are to convert those NetCDF formats into raster TIFF files that are more familiar formats for GIS users, at least, and image files. Standardizing the spatial resolution, so resampling to 250 meters to line up with the observational data sets. Standardizing the time steps, so making sure everything is available at annual, wet season, and dry season, at the very least. Doing some bias correction of the dynamical projections so that they better line up with the observed climate data. And working on a new manuscript to try to compare these two products and provide a bit of guidance for users and for modelers. So we have a team of different climate modelers and communication scientists that are working together on this to put this manuscript together. And we're going to try to write it in a very non-technical format, more plain language, accessible type of paper. So briefly, I just want to focus in on this bias correction step. So when we looked at the present day mean, I mentioned that the dynamical downscaling simulates its own historical present day rainfall. When we compared this to the present day mean based on observations, they're a little bit different. And these aren't the best maps to show this. If we subtract them and get a difference map, we can see that there are very large biases between how the model is simulating present day climate and what the observations are saying. So all these areas in red, the simulated mean is far under predicting what the observations say. So this is about half of the rainfall compared to the observations. And in some places, the simulated mean is double what the observations say. So, you know, we're seeing in percent change, this is 500% wetter in the simulated mean than what we're getting on the ground. So this is pretty common with model simulations, right? So they don't often agree with the observations. So we can do a bias correction step in the post-processing to correct the model output towards the observations a bit more. The disadvantage is it introduces that stationarity, which we were trying to avoid by using dynamical downscaling, but it allows for better comparison with the observations. So I've just used a very simple delta change approach, which is widely used. And you basically are using observed data instead of the simulated past data. So I'll show you briefly what the workflow looks like. Laura has seen a terrifying version of this, so I've tried to simplify it. So we start with a percent change map from the downscaling output. So what percent wetter or drier will our future rainfall be? And you multiply that by the present day mean to get the absolute change in the future. So how many inches wetter or drier will the future mean be? And then you take that absolute change and you add it to the present day mean to get your new future mean map. So what will the future mean rainfall look like? So this is the basic step that I'm doing to create these different derived products for each season. So to do the bias correction, I'm just replacing this present day mean with the observation product, not the simulated present day mean. And then we get everything standardized, everything related to the observations, and we remove those biases that you saw in this map. You're basically removing those biases. Okay, so for results, we now have, for each season, annual, wet season, and dry season, both RCPs. We have future percent change maps. We have absolute change maps. And we have future means, all in inches and millimeters. File names are all standardized. Spatial extent and resolution are all standardized. So you can compare statistical and dynamical downscaling now. So I'll just briefly show some of the results. These are the percent change maps by 2100. Statistical downscaling on the right, dynamical on the left. And do I have that backwards? Sorry, yes. From where I am standing, yes, sorry. So you can see that the patterns here look they look very, very different between the two when you start to break these down. So what we've done is, let's focus on the areas that agree in at least the sign of the change in the future, okay? So we mask out the areas that have a different sign of change. So all of these areas shown here at least agree that it will get wetter or drier in the future. And so this helps us to sort of make some general statements about what the models are showing so far for our future change. In general, you can kind of say that the leeward areas and the high elevation areas are looking like they will be drier in the future, although the magnitude depends on which model you're looking at. And then the windward areas may be slightly wetter. That's kind of the consensus we see here. If we look at the areas of disagreement, we can see there's a lot of coastal areas and a lot of Oahu where the models are really showing opposite signs of change. So, you know, if you're working in one of these areas, this starts to make some challenges in how you deal with this kind of uncertainty, not just in the magnitude, but in the sign of the change. So our next steps with that are just to finish up our plain language paper and, you know, come up with recommendations for users on how to contend with this uncertainty, and ideally recommendations for the modelers to standardize future efforts. And eventually work with Pacific RISA, UH Geography, and USGS to come up with a centralized website for the climate projection data where folks can go to get information and resources and data. So with that, I'll wrap up and just kind of saying that in general, you know, we should be moving towards more communication and collaboration and co-production between scientists and managers whenever possible. Build communication into the process. And you know, really striving to produce actionable products. So user-friendly outputs, plain language summaries, going beyond just the peer-reviewed paper. And we have our new projects where we're trying this out for drought here in Hawaii and the US-affiliated Pacific Islands, and other new efforts that we're trying to help translate these raw climate projections into more user-friendly formats. And with that, I will say thank you and take any questions.